I can see that we already have quite a few people joining us. We are going to get started in just about a minute. You see a poll question up on your screen. Thank you for being on with us today. Please feel free to answer that poll question at your convenience. We're going to leave it on, or leave it up, I should say, just for a little bit. And again, in about 30 seconds, we'll introduce the event, go over some troubleshooting, and then I'll hand this over to our speaker. So thank you to those who have joined so quickly this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are joining us from. Do not worry though, because we will also have time for Q&A with Jamie after her presentation. And if for some reason we don't get to your question,
Thanks, Jessica. Appreciate that. And thanks everyone for joining today. Really, really happy to be here. As Jessica said, my name is Jamie Patrick, and I lead the Sustainability and Climate Advisory team at Montrose Environmental Group. I'm based in Nashville, Tennessee, and I've been working in this environmental and sustainability space for almost 30 years, and mostly as a consultant and an advisor with clients. So we're going to get started. Just in general, how we're going to work today is we're going to talk a little bit about the basics. We're going to talk about climate change, what the difference between climate impact and climate risk is, and really just get everyone familiar with the terminology and the basics. And then we'll go a little bit forward and we'll jump into the actual interesting side note. I'm loving seeing kind of where folks are based in the chat here. Really glad to see some folks from all around the world joining the webinar today. Pose risks and opportunities to organizations, and we'll talk a little bit about some examples. But you know, physical risks very easy to understand. Wildfires, drought, flooding, et cetera. But there are also risks that are posed to companies as this world is moving towards a low carbon economy. And then these risks and these opportunities. Okay, so again, basics, impact, and risk. So we're going to just quickly dive into each one of those in a little bit more detail. And then we're going to jump into what regulations and frameworks have popped up in the last couple of years that are really driving a lot of change for how companies have to report these publicly. Are emitting and creating impact, and this is how we measure those emissions as well. So you'll see on the diagram, Scope 1 emissions are a company's direct emissions. So think about this in two ways. These are emissions due to combustion of fuel, either at a company's assets, buildings, plants, facilities, or through a company's fleet. And then lastly, we have Scope 3 emissions. You might hear these called value chain emissions, but these are the emissions that have to do with everything in your supply chain and your value chain. So everything from kind of the sourcing of raw materials, transportation of materials, everything coming into, let's say if you're a manufacturing facility, a manufacturing plant. So let's give it a moment here and we'll see the results come in that needs to be reported. So we can't really talk about the rules themselves without talking about some of these requirements and standards that provide some foundation for those rules. So again, everything you see on the screen here today, we're just gonna knock them off one by one and talk a little bit about what they are, who they apply to, and what the impact of those rules might be. Now, notable here, the SEC rules only require companies to report on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions were not included in the final rule. And just like we said before, those emissions have to be calculated according to the GHG protocol. And when disclosing risk, that's done in alignment with the TCFD recommendations or anything kind of similar to those. So who has to comply with this California rule? This rule applies to companies that are doing business in California that have a total annual revenue of greater than 1 billion. Now, this isn't revenue generated in the state of California. This is total revenue for the organization. So if you're a company that does business in California and you have a total revenue annually of greater than 1 billion, this rule will apply to you. California also issued SB 261, and together these are the climate accountability package. So SB 261 focuses more on the climate risk side of things, and this rule will require, this bill will require that companies every other year prepare a climate related financial risk report. Now, a quick note here, state of California, the California Air Resource Board is meant to be releasing its implementing regulations around these the 1st of January 2025. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the state of that in a bit. For the last 2 consecutive years, and meets one of those 3 requirements in the sub bullets, you will be subject to CSRD. And for most US companies, those requirements will come into effect. The first reports will be due in 2029. Okay, so that's a CSRD big picture. When it comes to climate, today we're really just focusing in on climate related disclosure rules. But we talked earlier about the TCFD. Again, foundational. This is a task force that published recommendations in 2017. These recommendations touched on kind of 4 different pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. The EU CSRD, if climate is a material topic, that standard, ESRS E1, also largely incorporates IFRS S2. Standards that can be used globally by individual jurisdictions. So these standards, the IFRS standards, they're not necessarily requirements as a standalone document, but we're seeing different jurisdictions, i.e. the European Union or individual countries, take these standards and adopt them into their regulations. So the ESRS E1 standard is meeting the requirements of these rules. They are reporting rules, but it's not as simple as just writing a report. There's a lot of work that has to go into you're going to eat the elephant one bite at a time, if you've heard that expression before. If you take all of this together, and it can be very overwhelming, I completely understand. And so take this in small chunks and take it one step at a time. So what I would really encourage folks to do is look at these different rules and requirements together comprehensively to determine, okay, which ones are applicable to us. Please don't let all these requirements overwhelm you. Really take it one step at a time. Do not take comfort in the fact that the SEC laws are currently stayed or that there's a risk of the CARB implementing regulations be delayed. In my mind, this time is a gift. Okay, so with that, Jessica, I think we've got just over 10 minutes or so for questions. The greenhouse gas protocol standards for scope 3 emissions, which is again, for now, it's not necessarily a one size fits all answer. I would really, your standard, but you definitely need to make sure you're paying attention to the timing of the SEC rules and the California rules, because that timing for those rules is likely to come into effect before the timing for the CSRD rules. And Jessica, I'm going to add one little asterisk on that.